this is Dan Mumm. I'm excited to bring you this special mini course. A common mistake guitarists run into is trying to learn as many techniques, scales, or patterns as they possibly can, moving from one to the next, with very little time spent actually internalizing or applying what they learn. As some of the most important distinctions required for achieving a true understanding of the instrument, as well as mastering the instrument, can only be achieved through deep comprehension of how patterns work and how they can be used. Moving rapidly from one unrelated pattern to the next can cause a guitarist to miss the most important aspects of what they're trying to learn, which will leave them frustrated and feeling that they aren't progressing as they should. While learning a ton of various scales and patterns may seem like the best approach, the reality is that much of what's learned when going through a single scale or pattern is applicable to many or most other scales or patterns. To gain a truly intuitive understanding of the guitar, you must become aware of these underlying connections. Once you do, you'll be able to learn or find other scales or patterns with ease, and often without additional memorization. With that in mind, a major part of my overall approach to making instructional courses is to demonstrate what I'm teaching you in such a way as to help you make certain connections and distinctions. And these will go far beyond the specific concept that's being demonstrated. In this case, while on the surface I'll be showing you variations of a simple A minor arpeggio pattern, we'll actually be killing quite a few proverbial birds with one stone. First of all, I want to show you a method of memorizing, practicing, and learning a pattern inside and out, and in such a way that the shape becomes completely intuitive to you. You can utilize methods like what we'll be doing here today on any pattern that you're learning. That is, taking a pattern and reworking it by breaking it down, working through it with sequences, starting at different parts or different notes, creating easy-to-remember melodies within the pattern, applying a rhythmic or melodic structure of a well-known melody to it, or pretty much anything that you can think of that would give you different perspectives and allow you to completely internalize the pattern. This will allow you to recognize the pattern starting from any note, instead of needing to rely on a starting point that you've become accustomed to using as a way to recall the entire pattern. That's a lot more important than you might think. All of this goes quite a bit deeper than that, but that's a good place to begin. You'll understand more as we go through the course. Every variation we use for this arpeggio pattern can be used on any other arpeggio pattern, and even scale patterns. While we'll be working with a simple A minor arpeggio pattern, you can also expand upon all of these ideas by adding other intervals, such as a seventh or a ninth. However, I strongly recommend waiting to try that until you've mastered what's taught in this course. Allow these concepts to become intuitive for you before muddying the waters by trying them on more complex patterns. Now, this is going to help you break out of playing habits that are the most common cause of getting stuck in a rut, but it also gives you the tools to find new and creative ways to utilize any given pattern, whether composing or improvising. On the technique side, working on a sweep pattern in this way will hone in on the sweep picking technique to break free from its basic uses and allow you to use it in many, many more contexts. This will also be more clear as we go through the exercises. Now, this is obviously a very short course, but my method of designing these courses is all about density of information being taught, and in such a way as to make the most important distinctions while simply working through exercises. In other words, even if you have no clue about what I'm talking about throughout this course, as long as you can follow the instructions and work your way through the exercises, you're going to achieve some of the most important benefits of this course. You see, I never want to simply teach you patterns to memorize, to add to an overwhelming amount of information to remember. I use patterns as a means of teaching you something more abstract that can benefit your understanding of the instrument and your technique in general, and can be applied across your existing knowledge of the guitar, as well as what you're going to learn in the future. All the while, of course, you're refining your technique and learning some killer patterns that you can use right now. With all of that out of the way, let's get into our first exercise. To begin, let's look at this A minor arpeggio. I should point out now that in this course, we'll be thinking of this pattern as something like a scale. Every note we play in every exercise will fit into this one pattern, and we'll never step outside of it in any of the exercises. This is one of the most popular types of sweep arpeggio patterns, and it's usually played simply going up the pattern and back down again. Today, we'll be doing quite a bit more than that. For starters, let's look at what this pattern is. The A minor arpeggio is made up of the triad A, C, and E. The A is the root, the C is the third, a minor third in the case of a minor triad like we have here, and the E is the fifth. This pattern is very direct, as it's simply made up of 2 octaves of the A minor triad played in succession. Basically, that's the same 3-letter notes, A, C, and E, being played twice, first in a lower octave and again in a higher octave. Take a look. So our first exercise actually has 3 parts to it. We go through the 2 A minor triads we just discussed separately, and then we go through the full pattern. While you might already know this pattern and have it down perfectly, I highly recommend putting time into each part. This isn't just about learning the pattern. We're setting the groundwork here for what comes later in this course. Taking your time with each exercise and each part is going to allow you to get the full effect of this course. Keep in mind that this course was carefully designed, and there's more to it than you'll be able to tell at first glance. If you skip or rush anything, you may miss out on some of the largest benefits. Trust me on this, you won't regret it. I'll now demonstrate all 3 parts of exercise 1. Make sure to pay close attention to the fingering and picking direction that you can find on the tabs. You'll notice that sometimes you must skip back over a string when changing pick direction. This is a really important part of sweep picking, and you should put in as much time as you need to get comfortable with it. It's also going to be very important for later exercises in this course. Note that we'll be using a hammer-on and a pull-off on the first string, so there are actually only 3 picked notes in part 2. This next exercise is also pretty simple. We're just going to play through 2 3-string patterns that we didn't focus on in the first exercise. However, this covers something very important. That is, sections of patterns that are often overlooked as potential harmonic alternatives or alternative starting points. It's also going to be our segue into sequencing. Now, these are inversions of the triad. The first part starts on the 3rd, goes to the 5th, and then the octave of the root. Part 2 starts on the 5th interval, goes to the octave of the root, and then an octave of the 3rd. On part 3 of this exercise, we'll be combining both patterns together, now as a very short sequence. Take it slowly at first and watch the picking direction carefully. While it's normal to tilt the pick in the opposite direction when sweep picking, in a pattern with more frequent changes in picking direction, like this one, it can be optimal to keep the pick almost straight. Here's the angled pick. Here's more of a straight up and down pick. Pay especially close attention to the picking direction changes on part 3, as it's slightly different from what's played in parts 1 and 2. Now we're going to get into sequencing. In part 3 of the last exercise, we played 2 iterations of a 5-note sequence. You're likely already familiar with sequencing scales, and this is basically the same idea. If you're not familiar, a sequence is a method of playing through a pattern, such as a scale, or an arpeggio in this case, using a repeated abstract pattern for each note of the original scale, or again, arpeggio. While that might sound complicated, it's actually pretty simple in practice. Let's say we want to use a simple 3-note sequence in an A minor scale. The abstract pattern would simply be playing 3 notes in order. So we'd start by positioning ourselves at the first note of the scale, and then simply play the first 3 notes of the scale. That would be the first iteration of the sequence. Then we'd start on the second note of the scale, and play 3 notes up the scale, starting from there. So you'd play the second note of the scale, the third note of the scale, and the fourth note of the scale. That pattern of playing 3 notes in order, ascending, is the abstract pattern. Basically, for a simple 3-note sequence, you'd take that pattern and apply it to the entire scale. So you'd play 3 ascending notes in order for each note of the scale. Let me demonstrate. For exercise 3, we'll be using a 3-note sequence, but applied to our A minor arpeggio pattern. We'll be excluding the last note on this exercise, so you won't have to worry about the hammer-on or pull-off. We'll first focus on the ascending portion, but using 2 different picking patterns. For part 1, we'll be using all downstrokes. This will require our pick to skip back over a string to begin the next iteration, while keeping the pick angle static. This method is more efficient for this exercise, and if you're already well practiced with sweeping, you're going to find this more natural. However, in some contexts, this method can actually create a disadvantage, and it's important that you're not dependent on it. Now for part 2, we'll be using downstrokes, but changing to a single upstroke when we change to the next iteration of the sequence. With this picking pattern, we'll need to keep the pick at more of a straight angle to allow for fluid transitions between picking directions. Now this method is usually more challenging at first, and it's not as efficient as the first method in many contexts. This picking method is most effective in patterns where sweeping happens in short bursts, combined with other techniques, or in complex patterns that shift picking direction frequently or unevenly. It also overlaps with economy picking in certain situations. However, this is something that you're going to want to independently get comfortable with, so that it's ready when you need it. When you're sufficiently comfortable with both, you'll naturally use whichever is more efficient in any given context. In this next exercise, we'll be playing the same pattern as exercise 3, only now we'll be descending. When putting together a course like this, it's critical for me to avoid and eliminate redundancies. In this case, exercise 4 may seem redundant, as it's the same pattern played in exercise 3, only now we're playing it in reverse. However, before we move on, it's incredibly important that you take the time to individually master the ascending and descending versions with both picking patterns. This is the only time in the course where we'll do this. Take your time and watch the picking directions carefully. Now, we're going to look at one more straight sequence. Only this time, we'll use all the notes of the pattern. It's important to point out the near infinite variety of possible sequence patterns that you could come up with. Using a normal scale or a longer or more complex arpeggio pattern, it gives you a lot of room to get really creative with developing sequences. The abstract pattern of a sequence can literally be anything. It can go up the scale and back again, down and up, repeat notes, or even skip around the scale within each iteration. You could use 2 notes, 3 notes, 4 notes, even 10 notes or more, whatever you want per sequence iteration. The abstract pattern can even have a special rhythm to it as well. And that's as opposed to playing straight 8ths or 16ths or some type of triplet as we'll be doing here. You can even use a melody as an abstract pattern and sequence it through a scale. As you could probably tell, sequence is something that's large enough to deserve its own specialty course. For the sake of this short course, we won't be getting deeper into it. Now, we worked with a 3-note sequence in exercises 3 and 4. Now we'll be doing a 6-note sequence. This sequence has something a little more interesting, though. First, it gives us an even 6 notes, which works perfectly for 4/4 time when played as triplets. But the 6th note is actually a repeat of the 5th note. This is a way to get a pretty cool sound, but it also dramatically affects the picking pattern. Normally, when changing directions during a sweep pattern or sequence, we'd need to skip over a string like we did in earlier exercises. In this case, we'll actually be picking over that string when we repeat the note. As always, pay close attention to the picking direction symbols on the tabs and play it exactly as written. All right, now we're going to look at a repeating pattern on the top 4 strings. This pattern is interesting because we're taking advantage of the placement of the notes on the first string of our A minor sweep pattern. Instead of using a hammer-on and a pull-off to play both notes on the first string, we're going to alternate those notes each time we repeat the pattern. It's pretty simple, but it could take some time to perfect. I wanted to include a pattern like this specifically to demonstrate what we're doing here and how this can be used. Since sweep picking technique is one of the main focuses of this course, and because most strings only have 1 note on them in the patterns that we'll be using, we can't do a lot of skipping around in the pattern. However, if we add another interval to the arpeggio, such as a 6th, 7th, or 9th, we can add more notes into our pattern, creating more of these hammer-on, pull-off sections on different strings. Adding those notes will create passages where you're actually playing 2 notes per string instead of 1, which increases the amount of times that we'd use a hammer-on or pull-off in the middle of a sweep pattern. But the beauty of it is that you don't have to play all of those notes. You can choose which note to play in these situations, allowing you to skip a note without having to skip a string. One example would be to take a pattern that has both the 5th and the 7th on 1 string. Maybe on the way up you play the 5th, but on the way back you only play the 7th on that string. With more complex arpeggios, you could even be doing chord substitution by simply omitting certain notes. The sky is really the limit with that. This exercise demonstrates the idea in basically the simplest way possible. It just goes back between the 5th and the minor 3rd on the top string as the rest of the arpeggio repeats normally. Now let's look at a couple more simple changes that actually have far-reaching potential for application. In this case, instead of starting on the lower octave of A, we'll actually be starting on the higher A. We'll still be playing the full A minor arpeggio pattern, only the starting point is changed. This is highlighted by the fact that we're using a quarter note at the start of each repeating section, and then 16th triplets for the rest of the notes. This also changes the point in the pattern, where you would change direction from ascending to descending. And this causes you to repeat some notes of the pattern before having played all of them. That alone can be used for a variety of effects. I recommend trying the same idea with other notes in the arpeggio. In other words, try starting on maybe the second or the third note of the overall pattern instead. With this in mind, you'd shift the entire pattern so that you're never skipping a string or note, but you're starting on a different note and then playing the rest of the full pattern. However, the change in rhythm is equally as important to pay attention to. Changing how a sweep pattern is expressed rhythmically can be the difference between a good solo and a fantastic solo. This can be used to break up the pattern in a way that gives it more of a melodic feel, or it can be used to create a groove or a texture. Just imagine syncopating a sweep arpeggio, for instance. Now, we'll have more examples of what can be done with the rhythm in the coming exercises. It's absolutely worth playing around with, trying different rhythms to fit an arpeggio shape in a certain time signature. It's a great exercise and method of practicing a sweep pattern, but it's also invaluable to know for working out parts and/or writing solos. Now, we're using 16th triplets here, and if that seems too fast for you right now, don't worry. Just get it down to a comfortable speed at first. All right, let's take the idea of using different rhythms and expand upon it. This exercise uses a combination of 8th and 16th notes. This gives the pattern a certain groove feeling to it. It kind of rocks back and forth. You'll notice a repeating rhythm here, with 1/8 note followed by 2 16th notes. That happens a few times, and then we have 4 16ths in a row. And that larger rhythmic pattern remains the same for the first 3 measures, changing only as it comes to an end in the 4th measure. Take a moment to really look closely at the notation above the tabs and find that rhythmic pattern. The first 3 measures of this pattern could be looked at as something like a complex sequence. As always, pay close attention to the picking direction on the tab. If there's a picking pattern you'd rather use for any of these patterns, that will be fine, but wait to do that until you've gotten these down. We'll continue here with another rhythm. This exercise uses rests instead of changing the rhythmic value of the notes. By doing this, we can get an overall rhythm and feel to the exercise, but we're also using the pattern now to play a distinctive melody. This is a great example of what can be done with a simple arpeggio pattern, beyond simply playing the notes of the arpeggio. Even though there are only 3 letter notes in this entire pattern, using the rests and creating a rhythm in this way turns it into a clear melody. You may also notice that this exercise is in 5/4 time, but that doesn't increase the difficulty in this context. Just work through it like you would anything else. Okay, we've made it to the last exercise of this mini course. As I mentioned early on, you can practice a pattern like our A minor arpeggio by applying a rhythmic or abstract melodic pattern from a song or melody you already know. There's no way to overstate just how effective this is for practice. In the case of this exercise, I've taken the rhythm and somewhat the abstract melodic pattern from J.S. Bach's Badineri. This is a great example of what you can do with arpeggios, and this specific example lends itself very well to the neoclassical style. Other than that, We've covered pretty much everything else you'll find on this exercise, but take your time and ensure you're getting the rhythm exactly right. All right, you made it to the end. Congratulations. I hope you really put the time in to practice these patterns and followed the instructions to get the most out of this mini course. If you haven't done that yet, or maybe you like to go through a course a couple times, I recommend taking your time with each exercise with the metronome. The trick is always spending a lot of time practicing, usually using an optimized practice approach, such as with a metronome, where you gradually increase the speed as you master the pattern at each tempo. Thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you again soon.